Until the lions have their own historians, the tales of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. Martin Bernal's seminal work, Black Athena, The Afroasiatic Roots of Classical Civilization, unveils a compelling narrative of the strategic erasure of Egypt's profound influence on Western intellectual development. Bernal meticulously examines how historical narratives were reshaped to diminish the Afroasiatic contributions that formed the bedrock of Greek and subsequently Western civilization. In Black Athena, he challenges deeply entrenched beliefs, revealing the intricate and often obscured connections between ancient Egyptian culture and the celebrated achievements of classical Greece. This groundbreaking exploration not only redefines our understanding of history, but also highlights the complex interplay of race, politics, and scholarship in shaping our intellectual heritage. This is a summary of the main arguments made by Martin Bernal.
I think that if people take Black Athena seriously, then they do have to look at our early history in a different way. Because always implicit and sometimes explicit in our view of history is that democracy and science and philosophy are exclusively European possessions, and that although peoples from other continents can learn them through Europe and European culture, they are essentially at home only in Europe.
Since the 17th century, racism has intensified significantly, particularly in Northern Europe and America, marking a profound shift that requires a deeper understanding. While prejudice against those who appear different has always existed, racism during this period reached unprecedented levels due to the complex interplay of colonization, scientific thought, and cultural shifts. Before the 16th century, it's challenging to gauge the extent of racial prejudices, because interactions between Northern Europeans and people from other continents were rare. However, medieval literature and societal treatment of groups like the Gypsies, who were often feared and ostracized for their dark features and mysterious qualities, indicate early forms of racism. The colonization of North America marked a pivotal increase in racism, with the extermination policies against Native Americans and the enslavement of Africans posing moral dilemmas for Protestant societies that valued equality before God and personal liberty. To reconcile these values with their actions, a robust ideology of racism was developed, asserting the superiority of white Europeans over other races. This justification was crucial for morally disentangling the acts of slavery and genocide from their religious and ethical beliefs. Philosophers like Aristotle were often cited to justify slavery, linking the concept of natural slaves to racial superiority. This idea was further entrenched by Enlightenment thinkers such as John Locke and David Hume, who, despite their contributions to philosophy, upheld racist views that dark skin indicated moral and intellectual inferiority. Locke's theories particularly facilitated colonialism by dismissing the rights of Native Americans and Africans based on their supposed failure to cultivate the land. The 18th century saw the rise of scientific racism, where empirical methods and nominalism by thinkers like John Locke began questioning the validity of a universal human species. This skepticism about human uniformity allowed for the categorization of races into hierarchies, further entrenching the belief in the inherent differences and superiority of certain races.
The idea of Romanticism became very closely linked to the idea of geographical determinism. That is, that people are formed by the landscape and climate they live in, and they get their feelings and their emotional sense of community from there. And it's also very linked to the notion that cold is good for you. That the further north you come from, or the further up the mountain you come from, the more virtuous you are. Now, Greece, ancient Greece, fitted this aspect of the Romantic model very well, but it was distressingly far south and with a distressingly equable climate. And therefore, I think from the end of the 18th century, you have the desire to associate Greece, which was now an admired culture, with the north rather than with the Mediterranean. So it sort of pushes people in that direction, to look for northern roots to explain the admired qualities of Greece.
Romanticism, a cultural movement emphasizing emotion and individualism over the rational ideals of the Enlightenment, also influenced racist narratives by idealizing the noble savage and other patronizing views toward non-European cultures. This movement was inspired by a renewed interest in folk traditions and languages, which were seen as pure expressions of a people's racial essence. The blend of racism with Romanticism and emerging notions of progress reshaped cultural identities in Europe, leading to a re-evaluation of Greek and Egyptian contributions to civilization. Greeks were romantically portrayed as youthful bearers of freedom and creativity, in stark contrast to the static and decadent ancient Egyptians. This shift redefined historical narratives, aligning them more closely with rising nationalism and the idealization of European heritage. By the late 18th century, historical perspectives had shifted significantly, moving from the ancient model, which revered Egypt as a cradle of civilization, to the Aryan model, which favored Indo-European roots as central to European heritage. In the last quarter of the 18th century, European intellectuals were captivated by the richness of Sanskrit and other Indian languages. This fascination wasn't merely academic. It had profound implications for understanding the relationships between European languages, eventually leading to the perception of an Indo-European language family. This development, tinted by the racial attitudes of the time, quickly morphed into the notion of an Aryan race, seen as kin to Europeans rather than just cultural predecessors like the Egyptians. At the same time, ancient Egypt's image transformed drastically. Previously seen as part of noble Caucasian ancestry, it began to be viewed through a racial lens emphasizing its African roots, portraying it as less noble. This shift was partly due to the increasing emphasis on racial and ethnic factors in historical explanations during that period. The idea that Egyptians were the forebears of the Greeks, who were considered the epitome of European youth, became ideologically and racially uncomfortable.
Of course, there are many classicists who object to what I'm saying, and some quite emotionally. A friend of mine tried to persuade a friend of his to buy a copy of the book in Heffer's, the main bookshop here. And as he was talking about the book, the shop assistant said, "Would you mind speaking up? I hear so many people muttering as they look at that book." So that clearly there is opposition. On the other hand, there's been very little hostile criticism in print.
Jean-François Champollion, central to the decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphs, found himself caught in these turbulent shifts. His revolutionary political leanings and academic preference for Egypt over Greece made him unpopular among his peers, affecting his career and contributions. Despite his breakthroughs in Egyptology, the field declined after his death in 1831, overshadowed by the rising fascination with Greece and Aryan origins. The Romantic era's emphasis on individual expression and the emotional essence of languages significantly influenced historical philology, the study of languages to trace cultural and historical lineage. Scholars like Franz Bopp, who linked European languages to Sanskrit, played a pivotal role in this field. However, their work also reflected the racial biases of the time, exemplified by the German term Indo-Germanic, which intertwined linguistic studies with notions of racial purity. Re-evaluating ancient civilizations through the lenses of race, language, and culture, this approach favored narratives that aligned with contemporary racial theories and the romantic nationalism of the era. Consequently, it often minimized or misrepresented non-European contributions to historical and cultural developments. To unravel this tale of historical biases, we need to examine an important historical timeline. Herodotus, often celebrated as the father of history, holds a controversial place in historical discourse. While some critics label him the father of lies, his chronicles of the ancient world were not mere fabrications, but grounded in verifiable facts that contemporary audiences could recognize and validate.
Now, the difficulty with Herodotus is that other stories he gives are clearly fictional. That if he talks about the pharaoh prostituting his daughter to raise money to build a pyramid, or he talks about a magic ring that makes people invisible, you can't take those seriously. On the other hand, Herodotus usually gives his sources who told him this, and when he has contradictory versions, he gives both of those contradictory versions rather than just giving his own synthesis. And I think he was serious in this, and he should not be neglected, because everything he wrote should not be discounted, because he wrote some things that don't fit our laws of natural science.
In the 5th century BC, it was widely believed in Greece that the nation's early history was significantly influenced by settlers from Egypt. This claim forms the backbone of Herodotus's accounts of Egyptian and Phoenician impacts on Greek civilization, views that modern scholars have often viewed with skepticism, but were standard in Herodotus's era and even earlier times. A significant part of this ancient narrative involves the Pelasgians, the mysterious early inhabitants of Greece. These people are frequently mentioned across various Greek texts, with their roles and attributes shifting subtly from one story to another. According to the epic poet Homer, the Pelasgians participated actively on both sides of the Trojan War, indicating their widespread presence in ancient Greek territories. The etymology of place names associated with the Pelasgians, such as Larissa, often traces back to ancient Egyptian, suggesting deeper historical connections between Greece and Egypt than commonly acknowledged. For instance, the name Larissa could be derived from the Egyptian term for entry into the fertile lands, a nod to the region's rich agricultural lands. These links highlight the blend of myth and reality in Greek historical understanding, significantly shaped by Near Eastern influences. The story of Danaus, a mythical figure believed to have introduced significant cultural and religious innovations from Egypt to Greece, further illustrates this cultural synthesis. Under his influence and through interactions with other Eastern cultures, the Pelasgians gradually assimilated these elements, transforming into what would become Hellenic culture. Herodotus documented that this transformation wasn't just mythological, but could be seen in the linguistic and cultural practices across Greece. For example, places like Dodona, renowned for its oracle, were referred to as Pelasgian, suggesting the enduring influence of this ancient people into classical times. Despite these profound connections to external cultures, there was a strong movement within Greece to define a distinct identity separate from its eastern neighbors. This movement became especially pronounced later, as exemplified by the historian Thucydides, who emphasized distinguishing Greek civilization from its barbarian neighbors, rather than acknowledging its multicultural roots. Herodotus's histories offer more than just accounts of the past. They reflect the multifaceted processes of cultural interaction and assimilation that have shaped civilizations throughout history. His stories remind us that the foundations of any culture are rarely monolithic, but are instead composed of myriad influences and narratives that must be understood in their full complexity to appreciate the true essence of historical evolution. While modern scholarship might critique Herodotus for his supposed inaccuracies, his writings remain a pivotal resource for understanding the deep and rich connections that form the bedrock of ancient Greek culture. They emphasize a shared human heritage that transcends modern notions of historical and cultural boundaries. The 19th century scholar Niebuhr dismissed Greek explanations of the Pelasgian identity as absurd, highlighting a long-standing challenge in understanding this group's historical place. The concept of the Pelasgians fits awkwardly within the Aryan model of Hellenic conquest, which suggests a northward movement of Greek-speaking people. This theory struggles to explain why there's no collective memory of a Pelasgian conquest, if such events were significant. This puzzle is compounded by historical figures like Thucydides, who described the Pelasgians as being Hellenized, gradually through interactions, rather than overt conquest. A revised understanding proposes that the Pelasgians were indigenous, Indo-European speaking peoples, who were culturally influenced by external, mainly Egypto-Phoenician, invasions. Interestingly, later historical accounts often place the Pelasgians in remote or less assimilated regions, like Arcadia, possibly as remnants of Proto-Greeks who retained fewer external influences. This notion is similar to cultural distinctions seen in other parts of the world, where peripheral groups preserve older cultural elements, while central regions evolve more rapidly due to external influences. The narrative around the Pelasgians is not just about their identity, but also their role in broader Greek history. They are often portrayed as the foundation upon which later Greek, Hellenic culture was built, transitioning from native groups to integrated parts of the classical civilizations depicted in Greek tragedies and historical texts. Modern interpretations of Greek history influenced by new discoveries and evolving scholarship, continue to debate the extent of these ancient interactions. While some argue for a significant Near Eastern influence, others emphasize a more gradual and less direct integration of these elements into Greek culture, often overshadowed by more familiar narratives of Spartan warriors and Athenian philosophers. The Pelasgians represent an ancient population whose origins and identity have perplexed scholars from Herodotus to modern historians. In classical texts, the Pelasgians are mentioned sporadically, woven into the myths and legends of the ancient world. Herodotus, often revered as the father of history, provides accounts that hint at their widespread presence across Greece and the Aegean islands, portraying them as a pre-Hellenic people who were eventually assimilated into the emerging Greek culture. The fascination with the Pelasgians isn't just a matter of historical curiosity, it touches on broader themes of cultural assimilation and identity. The ancient Greeks themselves had a vague understanding of the Pelasgians, treating them as both a distinct group and as precursors to their own civilization. This dual view reflects the complexities of ancient identity, where the lines between native and foreigner, primitive and civilized, were often blurred. Modern scholarship has not resolved the mystery of the Pelasgians, but has reinvigorated it by applying new archaeological findings and scholarly theories. For instance, debates persist about whether the Pelasgians spoke a language related to Hellenic, Greek languages, or whether they spoke a completely different language family. The answers to these questions have significant implications for understanding the cultural and linguistic landscape of prehistoric Europe. Moreover, the Pelasgians are often linked to various archaeological sites across Greece and the Mediterranean. These sites sometimes reveal a layer of civilization that predates classical Greek culture, suggesting a complex sequence of migration, settlement, and cultural exchange long before recorded history. In addition to historical and archaeological pursuits, the Pelasgians also feature in Greek mythology, where they are depicted in various roles ranging from builders of monumental structures to mysterious oracles. These mythological depictions underscore the enigmatic status of the Pelasgians in Greek cultural memory, highlighting an enduring fascination with the origins and fate of this ancient people. Herodotus, often hailed as the father of history, crafted his narratives around 450 BC, weaving a rich tapestry that connected Europe, primarily Greece, with the continents of Asia and Africa. His extensive travels across the Persian Empire provided him with unique insights into the cultural exchanges and conflicts of these regions. The influence of ancient Egypt has endured, permeating modern culture, philosophy, and religious thought long after the fall of its grand civilization. This legacy is particularly evident in religious and philosophical beliefs, where Egyptian motifs and ideas have been integrated into Christianity and other sects. One of the most profound contributions from Egypt is the Memphite theology, dating back to the 2nd or 3rd millennium BC. This theology describes how Ptah, the god of Memphis, conceived the world in his heart and brought it into existence through divine speech. This concept parallels the idea of the Logos in Platonic and Christian philosophy, where the universe is created through a divine word or thought. Egyptologist James Breasted studied the Memphite theology and suggested that the ancient Egyptians already understood abstract philosophical concepts, similar to those seen later in Greek philosophy. This supports the argument that Greek philosophical ideas, particularly those related to the nous, mind, and logos, reason or word, may have been influenced by Egyptian thought. Thoth, the Egyptian god of wisdom, is central to this cross-cultural exchange. Traditionally viewed as the heart and tongue of Ptah, Thoth embodies wisdom and communication. He is credited with inventing writing, mastering mathematics, and originating magical spells, making him a key figure in synthesizing various theological and philosophical traditions. The synthesis of Thoth and Anubis, another Egyptian deity, into the figure of Hermanubis illustrates the blending of roles typical of Egyptian deities. Thoth's role as a communicator and Anubis's role as a guide to the afterlife highlight the complex and adaptable nature of Egyptian theology. The influence of Egyptian religion on Greek thought became particularly evident during the Hellenistic period, especially after Alexander the Great's conquests. The Greek version of Thoth, Hermes Trismegistus, embodies this synthesis. Seen as a philosopher, sage, and moral teacher, Hermes Trismegistus represents a fusion of Greek and Egyptian religious and philosophical thought. Hermeticism, a tradition steeped in both Greek and Egyptian thought, illustrates the continuity of ancient wisdom through various cultural transformations. Although later influenced by Greek philosophy, Hermeticism retains a fundamentally Egyptian core, particularly in its conception of the cosmos and the divine's role in the material world. The survival and transformation of these ideas through Hermetic texts suggest a more complex interplay of cultural influences than previously acknowledged. These texts, possibly dating back to the Persian period of Egyptian history, blend older Egyptian religious concepts with newer Hellenistic and possibly Mesopotamian influences. Despite the dominance of Christianity in Western Europe, the mystique of Egypt as a hub of magical and esoteric knowledge persisted. Artifacts such as scarabs and symbolic representations found in the tombs of early medieval rulers like Childeric, and later in imagery associated with Charlemagne, reflect the continued veneration of Egyptian religious symbols and deities. During the medieval period, interest in Hermetic texts primarily focused on aspects of astrology and magic rather than philosophy. However, the philosophical treatise Asclepius, translated into Latin in the 2nd century, maintained a continuous presence in scholarly circles. By the 11th and 12th centuries, its circulation increased, suggesting a rekindled interest in Hermetic philosophy during the 12th century Renaissance in Western Europe. The Renaissance, often celebrated as a revival of Greek classical learning, was equally a period of profound engagement with Egyptian and broader Oriental wisdom. Early Renaissance scholars, artists, and patrons aimed not only to emulate the Greece of Homer or Pericles, but also to continue the intellectual pursuits of pagan antiquity. This engagement included a deep respect and fascination with Egyptian culture and philosophy. The Renaissance drew heavily on Neoplatonic and Hermetic traditions, promoting the idea of infinite human potential and the concept that man is the measure of all things. This perspective was integral from the onset of the Renaissance in the 14th and early 15th centuries, demonstrating significant respect and admiration for Egyptian intellectual traditions. The Renaissance's embrace of hieroglyphics went beyond their exotic appeal, rooted in the belief in their profound allegorical significance. Renaissance thinkers saw hieroglyphics as a sacred script, a more evolved form of expression that transcended the phonetic limitations of ordinary language. This belief was based on interpretations of ancient Egyptian priests' use of allegories, a practice detailed by classical authors like Plutarch. Despite modern scholars arguing that Renaissance thinkers might have misinterpreted these allegories, the intellectuals of the time believed they were uncovering the true philosophical and mystical teachings of the ancient Egyptians, embedded in the enigmatic hieroglyphs. The Renaissance's fascination with Egyptian wisdom stemmed from the long-held belief that Egypt was the birthplace of mysteries and sacred rites. This perception extended beyond esoteric circles and was widely acknowledged as Egypt's primordial role in the genesis of ancient wisdom and arts. Renaissance thinkers, like Giordano Bruno, explicitly recognized Egypt as the fountainhead of ancient narratives and doctrines, profoundly influencing Greek and Roman culture. This reverence for Egyptian wisdom was institutionalized with the founding of the Neoplatonic Academy in Florence by Marsilio Ficino. The Academy placed Hermetic texts at the heart of its curriculum, reflecting a broader Renaissance trend of seeking ancient wisdom to connect with divine truths of antiquity. In the 16th century, Hermeticism and the respect for ancient Egyptian wisdom flourished within high Renaissance culture. The extensive publication and translation of key Hermetic texts during this period, such as those by Marsilio Ficino, which went through multiple editions, showcase their widespread popularity and the enduring appeal of Egyptian and Hermetic knowledge. This ongoing interest contrasts sharply with the modern perception that the Renaissance was primarily about reviving Greek thought. Travel narratives of Egypt outnumbered those of Greece from the 15th to the 17th centuries, indicating a stronger European interest in Egyptian culture and wisdom. Influential figures like Paracelsus, although falsely claiming to have visited Egypt, drew upon its supposed wisdom to legitimize their radical approaches to science and medicine. This period saw a significant shift where European scholars and intellectuals started to justify experimental science as a means to recover the lost wisdom of Egypt and the Orient, wisdom believed to have been overlooked by the Greeks and Romans. The Renaissance admiration for Egypt puzzled and distressed 19th and 20th century scholars who struggled to reconcile this with their views on European cultural superiority. The fascination with Egyptian gods, often referred to by their Latin names, but understood to be fundamentally Egyptian, permeated Renaissance thought. Illustrations and texts from the period reflect a preference for Eastern and Egyptian divinities, fueled by the contemporary craze for hieroglyphics and the mysteries they were thought to encode. The Renaissance was not merely a backward glance towards ancient Greece's glory, but a deep dive into the sources of all ancient wisdom, with Egypt seen as the ultimate font of knowledge. This respect for ancient Egyptian culture and philosophy profoundly influenced the intellectual debates and scientific inquiries of the time. Notably, Copernicus, celebrated for his heliocentric model, was influenced not only by Greek, but also by Egyptian heliocentric ideas, illustrating the complex web of intellectual influences that characterized the Renaissance. In the early 18th century, the allure of ancient Egypt was epitomized in popular culture and literature, such as Fenelon's Telemachus, which portrayed Egypt as a land of immense wisdom and justice, far superior to Greece. This period witnessed an Egyptomania that saw Egypt as the cradle of profound philosophical and mystical knowledge, influencing various Western thinkers and writers. The widespread interest was not just in its historical and cultural significance, but also in its perceived mystical and esoteric wisdom. By the mid-18th century, the fascination with Egypt was both scholarly and popular. Figures like Giovanni Battista Vico and Montesquieu acknowledged Egypt's substantial contribution to world philosophy and wisdom, often placing it above Greek contributions. The work of scholars like the Abbé Barthélemy in the 1760s further solidified academic interest in Egyptian history and language, linking it to broader Semitic and Afroasiatic studies, despite the complexities of Coptic and Greek etymological connections. Despite critiques from scholars like Isaac Casaubon, who questioned the antiquity of the Hermetic texts, interest in these writings continued to thrive. Figures like Ralph Cudworth and other Cambridge Platonists defended them as sources of ancient wisdom, arguing that these texts, regardless of their exact historical origins, contained invaluable philosophical insights that predated and influenced Greek philosophy. The idea of progress, with roots extending back to the 16th century, gained widespread acceptance from 1670 to 1770, particularly as Europe recovered from religious conflicts. Europeans recognized that they possessed technologies and products such as sugar, paper, printing, and gunpowder that were not known to the ancients, many of which came from Asia. Louis XIV of France, revered as Le Roi Soleil, the Sun King, embodied this new era of progress. His reign became synonymous with grandeur and moral stature, perceived to surpass ancient epochs. The glorification of Louis XIV intertwined with elements of sun worship and alchemical symbolism, creating a powerful narrative that played into the political and cultural consolidation at Versailles. This period blended spectacle and governance to unify French society under a banner of cultural and scientific superiority. The 18th century saw a vigorous debate between the ancients and moderns. The French writer Perrault and the moderns posited that their era, reflective of enlightenment and rationality exemplified by Louis XIV, was superior to that of the ancient Greeks, whom they viewed as comparatively barbaric. This discourse influenced a wide range of cultural and intellectual expressions across Europe. Interestingly, Egypt played a significant role in this narrative. During Louis XIV's reign and beyond, Egypt was often portrayed as a source of profound ancient wisdom, frequently linked with the grandeur of the French monarchy. This association helped frame Egypt as a beacon of the moderns in ongoing intellectual debates, juxtaposing its storied past with the perceived simplicity and primitiveness of Homeric Greece. The literary world of the 18th century reflected these themes vividly. Works like Fenelon's Telemachus and Terrasson's Sethos celebrated the wisdom and superiority of ancient Egyptian civilization and used it as a narrative device to critique and analyze contemporary European society. These works argued that the philosophical and scientific advancements attributed to the Greeks were, in fact, inherited from their more enlightened Egyptian predecessors. As we delve into the pivotal changes of the 18th century, we see a significant shift in how European civilization viewed its origins and the forces shaping its understanding of history and progress. The fall of the ancient model, which placed Egypt at the foundation of European culture, and the rise of Greece as the cradle of civilization, were influenced by key factors: Christian reactions, the evolving concept of progress, emerging racist ideologies, and the romanticization of Hellenism. These elements redefined historical narratives and impacted Europe's cultural and academic landscapes. For nearly 2 millennia, the relationship between Christianity and Egyptian philosophy was complex, but largely non-antagonistic. This dynamic changed as movements like Hermeticism and Masonry, which delved into Egyptian Esoterica, began to clash more directly with Christian doctrine. Notably, the early church's aggressive stance against Gnosticism and Neoplatonism marked early instances of these conflicts. However, by the 15th and 16th centuries, the church showed a more tolerant, if not supportive, attitude towards Hermeticism, demonstrating a nuanced relationship with Egyptian thought. The concept of progress dramatically reshaped European intellectual thought, suggesting that newer civilizations, including their own, had surpassed ancient ones in sophistication and achievement. This new perspective cast Egypt's remarkable stability and longevity, once admired, as stagnant and obsolete compared to the dynamic nature of European development. The emergence of racial theories in the 18th century further reinforced this view, unfavorably comparing African cultures, including Egypt, to the dynamic European race and elevating Greece as a more fitting progenitor of European civilization. Racism intertwined with the idea of progress to diminish Egyptian contributions while glorifying Greek civilization. This alignment was perfect for the era's burgeoning Romanticism, which celebrated the dynamic, heroic qualities found in Greek epics like those of Homer resonating with Northern European romantic ideals. Greece's geographic location and its historical ties to the broader Middle East were overshadowed by its cultural and linguistic ties to Northern Europe, embedding it further within the European identity. The intellectual climate of this period was ripe for re-evaluating historical sources and prioritizing Greek studies over Egyptian scholarship. Figures like Richard Bentley and Isaac Newton used their scholarly and scientific prowess not only to advance the Newtonian physical model, but also to critique the reliability and age of Greek sources that referenced Egyptian wisdom. This academic rigor served to discredit the antiquity and relevance of Egyptian wisdom, aligning scholarship with Christian apologetics. The interplay between these forces, Christian doctrinal reactions, the redefinition of progress, racial theories, and the romantic idealization of Greece, collectively facilitated the decline of the ancient model. This model, which had placed Egypt at the base of European cultural and intellectual heritage, was systematically dismantled in favor of a narrative positioning Greece as the true originator of European civilization. The 18th century thus marked a profound shift in European cultural and intellectual history. The reassessment of what constituted progress, coupled with evolving racial ideologies and a romanticized view of history, redefined the role of ancient civilizations in the European narrative and set the stage for future academic and cultural developments. This period's legacy highlights how historical perceptions are shaped by the convergence of multiple, sometimes conflicting, intellectual and cultural currents. Until the lions have their own historians, the tales of the hunt will always glorify the hunter.